Now let's move down to this effects section that is below the polyphonic processing section. This consists of an 8-pole filter, an echo, a reverb, as well as the all-important master slider and an oscilloscope for visualizing the waveform and output. This 8-pole filter is a little unique. It has features that most filters don't have. Essentially what it is a high and low pass filter for each channel. So for each of the stereo channels, for left and right, we have a high and a low pass filter. And most of these parameters determine how those filters interact with one another and how to produce interesting sounds by accentuating those interactions. So let's just refresh though. The poles are essentially as I toggle over to live, I'm going to show you this EQ8, which shows you graphically the 4 poles in a 4-pole filter, right? And we have it set flat now. But each of these poles allows you to alter that particular point in the frequency spectrum and move through it, right? So here we're visualizing a low-pass filter. And I can also move to, say, a high-pass filter and use our poles accordingly here. So this gives you an idea of what poles are. I say this just because you hear a lot of talk about poles, and sometimes I think it's not explained well enough. Anyway, let's move back to REAKTOR and take a look at this. So the center control determines the mean cutoff frequency for both channels. So it's going to average the cutoff frequencies of both those channels, and then it's going to allow you to control that with this center control. Now left and right is a balance between the cutoff frequencies of the 2 channels, right? So if you want to have, because these run in parallel, if you want to kind of make a difference or establish some difference between the left and right channel filter cutoffs, you can use this to do that. And you hear it does add some kind of subtle filter tweaking to the sound. Now, I believe the most interesting parameter here is this gap parameter, because what this allows you to do is to alter the cutoff frequencies of the high and low pass filters on both channels. So because they run in parallel, you can have the high and low pass essentially overlap or produce band reject effects. When you have gaps set in the positive direction, it is going to give you those band reject effects, and you can hear it rejecting a lot of the frequencies. When we crank it up to maximum, it's really kind of zeroing out a lot of those frequencies. They're canceling each other out. But when we pull it negative, what we have is a situation in which essentially all of the frequencies are passing through, but we also have the resonance effects of both the high and low pass filter cutoffs. So we have kind of all frequencies and a little accentuation from the filter cutoffs. And then of course, resonance will be familiar to most of you who have used a filter. This resonance, importantly, only pertains to the low-pass filter. So it makes it a little more manageable. Now this balance is the balance between the low-pass filter, I believe this is right, between the low-pass filter on the left, both in the middle, and then just the high-pass filter on the right. So, like most of this ensemble, this is kind of an experimental feature. It's really a new take on filtering. So, a good idea is to scroll through some of the snapshots and find one that has filter settings that you like or has filter movements that you like, and then replicate that in your own sounds. Now, this echo unit next to the 8-pole filter is really interesting because aside from producing the normal kind of delay effects that we expect from such a unit, it also produces some really cool final effects. But let's just get a sense for it to start. Now the mix slider, which I failed to explain before, is a mix between a dry signal and a wet signal. Right? So if I just play a note completely dry, and then I crank it and I play a note wet, now it's delayed coming in because all we're hearing is the delay signal. Once I crank it to the middle, however, you'll hear both. So there we have it in the middle. And now let's come down and explain this. Time, of course, is the delay time, but in this case it's a mean delay time because since you can alter the delay times of the left and right channels, this kind of averages the two. And when you have this sync button off, this is going to move in milliseconds, right? You hear some of that vinyl effect that I was talking about. As you're playing, you get some of that. So when the sync is set to off, as I mentioned before, but I was probably playing at the same time, so you might not have heard, the time will adjust in milliseconds. But then when you sync it on, it will adjust to beat subdivisions, right? So it'll kind of lock into different beat subdivisions. Now I'm going to turn this off because I like the millisecond setting. Left and right is the ratio between the delay times of these channels. So in the middle, there's no difference. But as you start to move it to either side, you'll notice that you're getting different delay times on the left and right channels. So this is interesting because you can kind of fine-tune what's happening on each channel and really get it to your taste. Now, feedback, of course, is pretty familiar. It's how much of the delayed signal is going back into the delay. So the higher up you crank this, the more kind of heavy delay you're going to get, because more of that delayed signal is going back in and then subsequently being delayed again. You hear it's still continuing on there. This is an extraordinarily high-quality unit. One of the benefits of allowing instruments to be built in Reaktor is that they're not really paying the development costs of building a new instrument from scratch. And so you have these really excellent, super high-quality instruments that end up being a lot cheaper because the platform is already there. That's a digression. So anyway, let's continue on with low-cut and high-cut. Now, these are a low-cut filter or a high-pass filter for the delayed signal, and a low pass or high cut filter for the delayed signal. So this is how you can shape that delay, right? So if you want, sometimes what happens is you have low frequencies being delayed and it really muddies up your mix. So you can cut out those low frequencies or high frequencies with this and really get kind of zoomed in on that individual sound that you want to be part of the delay, but might not be part of the original, or might not have the full frequency content of the original because it would become too unruly. So I really like this. This is one of my favorite parts of Scanner. I like using those vinyl effects that you heard earlier. So yeah, get in there and just kind of root around. Use this time knob. Try tweaking this time knob as you're playing, and you'll find you get some really cool effects. This reverb unit allows us to add space to our sound, and reverb is probably familiar to many of you. This works in essentially the same way as the echo, at least from the perspective of adding the effect. So when we have a dry signal, we're not going to hear that reverb, but once we begin to crank it over to the middle, we'll have a mix of wet and dry. So you hear the space in there. And the more over to the side of the wet signal I go, the more you'll hear it. I'm going to switch over to a different snapshot so that we have a more reverb-friendly signal. So for this one, for example, it's kind of this wood sound percussion. Now, size adjusts the size of the room that you're emulating, right? So at a smaller size, you're talking about a smaller size room. As you raise it, you're talking about more of like a concert hall. Here, that delay really has a long tail. Again, this is a very high quality unit. This is not some kind of cheap afterthought that they throw in to say that it has effects. This is really very high quality. And then these low and high cut controls are basically identical to the ones we have in Echo. They allow you to damp the sounds of the reverb display, or damp frequencies in the reverb display that you don't want in there, right? So if you want to cut out low frequencies, cut out some of the high frequencies as well, and then just kind of zero in on the sound you want, you can do it that way just by making small adjustments. But don't pass this over. This is an excellent effect, and it deserves to be used with your sounds. Now, finishing off this effects unit, we have at right a master slider or a master level, which allows us to determine, of course, the master level of the ensemble, so important for obvious reasons. We also have a 2 feedback indicator, which is kind of like this 2 feedback in the polyphonic processing section. This just tells you where in the signal chain the feedback is going to be taken. So the feedback signal is going to be taken after all of these effects have been laid onto the original signal. And then, of course, here we have our scope that allows us to see our waveform as a graphical display. Now, one thing I should say is that before the output stage, there is a soft clipper, and what that does is keeps the sound normalized so that you don't clip your sound card. It's actually invisible, but it's a very nice thing to know that you're not going to blow up your sound card by dragging this too high. Great, so now we're through the effects section, and in the next video we're going to take a look at this bottommost section, which is really 2 parts. It's the modulators and the macro controls. Right now we have it set to macro controls, but we can switch over using this button at bottom. And the macro controls, of course, are the under the hood controls that we have for the macros that we saw in the A panel view, right? These are identical source variation, filter, and space, and we have all of our destinations here. And then, of course, for modulators, we have the individual parameters for the modulation sources that we use up here. So this is really the under the hood stuff that we're going to get into next, and I think you'll find that this really blows things up in terms of the possibilities that you have for shaping your sound.